Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Loosely Coupled, brought to you by Bridging the Gap. My name is Karol Skrzywowski, and I'll be your host. And today I'm out of beans, so no coffee, but I got some green tea for a change. So still sufficiently caffeinated. Tain also counts, right? And today we're kicking off the year. So if anybody didn't notice, we changed the year. So Happy New Year, everybody. A little bit late, but never too late. And we're kicking off with a very interesting topic of a living language, which is something quite important for architects and dev teams and business to actually look into if they want to be successful in implementing any kind of IT solution without a lot of bugs and failures and misconceptions and assumptions along the way. And joining me today to chat about this is Chris Simon, coming to us, used to be from Australia, now it's from France. Chris is a technology coach and advisor, helping technology teams, startups, CTOs to get running and doing some really cool, fun stuff. So, Chris, welcome to the stream.
Hi, Karol. How's it going?
Yeah, it's a nice evening in the Netherlands. How about France? How's the weather?
We're getting a little rain tonight, but it's not so bad. It's starting. I can feel the weather's gradually starting to pull up out of the depths of the midwinter. So that's nice for me because it's been much colder than I'm used to.
I would guess so. Yeah, this winter to this year is also quite cold. Minus 20 in Poland at times. Heavy snowfall in the Netherlands. I mean, I asked my neighbors, and they haven't seen so much snow in years. So
Wow.
I literally had to go on the roof and shovel snow off so that it doesn't collapse. And we literally had some instances where roofs collapsed in the Netherlands because people were not aware that you should actually go and remove the snow because it's heavy. Wow. So yeah, it's going. But it's New Year, no snow anymore, only a little bit of cold. That's the thing. So, Chris, tell us something about yourself because Australia is far away. Not everybody knows you. You're in the DDD space, so everybody watching from interested in DDD, they probably know your name. But well, we have a lot different audience at times. So go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess my background, I've spent most of my career working in startups. I was a co-founder of a startup in Australia a long time ago now, 20-something plus years ago. And so, as a co-founder, I was a technical co-founder. So I've had the title of CTO for a long time, since well before I deserved it or had earned it, which was quite fun. I used to joke that I was the chief technology officer and the chief lunch fetcher and the chief bathroom cleaner because, there were 5 of us in the company. But over time, that company grew. We ended up launching a couple of different business lines and products. We sold one of them to a bank in Australia. One of the other one's still running with a decent sized staff and is reasonably successful. And about 4 years ago, I decided, I spent a lot of my time working in this one company. We've grown it and evolved a lot over the years, but I was really keen to see more, but didn't want to completely lose my connection. So I decided to go into consulting. So I've been an independent consultant for the past 4 years. I've done a bunch of different things. I do a lot of coaching of startup CTOs. Do a lot of consulting for engineering teams, helping them with architecture and architecture review. I found over the years with that business that the area that I got most excited about was the architecture and the design, because I saw what an impact it had on the long-term success of the business and the cost base of operating and evolving the business. When you watch the same software system literally for 20 years, and you see how the design decisions made in 2005 are still having an effect in 2024, 2025. It really gives you an appreciation for the impact of some of the design decisions that you make and architectural decisions that you make. And I know a lot of people often think, they're thinking about design decisions with a time frame of 6 months or 12 months. And, in a lot of cases, maybe that's reasonable. Things are evolving so rapidly, systems are put to bed. But I always have in my head, you just never know which line of code is still going to be sitting there, churning away 20, 30 years from now.
Usually the bad one is going to stay, right?
Unfortunately, that's true. But this journey over the years, it sort of, fortunately led me into the world of DDD. And so I made that a core focus of my consulting practice as well. I've ended up speaking at DDD Europe a few times and running training programs in DDD. I'm running a training program through DDD Academy in a couple of months called Imagine the Future and Build for Now, which is sort of my attempt to balance this sort of long-term, short-term thinking as we tackle design challenges. Because I'm a big believer that you need to contemplate the future, but I'm also from that startup lens with a big focus on cost management and not overdoing it, not overboiling the ocean. So how do you reconcile these two perspectives is a big part of that training course. And the other thing that I sort of got into, because one of the businesses had some really complex domain logic going on, sort of an insurance payments space, and a lot of complex language as well. So one of the first talks I gave was called When Customers Don't Share a Language. And it was trying to tackle this challenge you have. If you're familiar with DED, we have this idea of the ubiquitous language. We should define terminology. We should be clear about what the words mean. We should encourage ubiquitous or like universal use of that language. There's sometimes a lack of clarity about what ubiquitous means. Sometimes people think it means like the same terminology across the whole company, which is not necessarily the case. What it really means is anyone working in a particular area should be using that language consistently in code and conversations and documentations.
What you said.
Oh, sorry.
What you just said about the same language in the whole company, that brings me to a conversation that I had this week at work. That would be canonical data model.
Yeah, exactly.
Canonical is never something that is that good, because it often becomes dogmatic, and that's problematic.
It's not practical. I think once you get beyond a certain size and complexity, it's not practical to have a canonical model. And it's interesting because part of the reason is the inherent complexity of the model, and part of it is the difficulty of sharing the knowledge of what that model means across such a broad range of people. When you look at things that we do in software like modularity and DDD bounded contexts, to some extent, part of that is about encapsulating technical complexity, but in a more impactful sense, I think a lot of it is about encapsulating the human complexity and the need to manage the flow of knowledge between people as it evolves. And so when we talk about, databases don't care about a canonical data model. You can have a billion fields and columns and tables, and the database will keep chugging along. But how can one human understand all of that? They can't. How could one team understand all of that? They can't. So a lot of it's about dealing with our human limitations of what we can understand. But yeah, absolutely. The canonical data model, or the ubiquitous language that is applied universally across the whole company. And I always laugh because you see companies where, they've been dealing with maybe bifurcated or disparate languages and models for a long time, and there's this dream. We just need one view of the customer. Can we just have one view of the customer? The single pane of glass that shows us everything we need to know about a customer. And the truth is, it's a bit of a fool's errand, because you never can quite get it, pin it all down into that one beautiful, fantastical view. Different elements of the customer are evolving on different phases and times and life cycles, and you've got customers that have in different states, or they were in a state but now they're not, or they're maybe going back. It's
we touched upon that just before the stream when we were just chatting. This is basically model drift, as described by Barry O'Reilly. The moment you try to pin something down, it already drifted away. Business already evolved, and you have new definition of everything, and it's just not feasible, because our context, our problem domain just evolves too quickly, way quicker than we can model it, and way quicker than we can code it, basically.
Yeah, but that's not a reason to give up, right? We still, code is what it is. Obviously with AI these days, people are finding it easier to change the code with varying degrees of success. But there's still I think a sense that changing the code is slower than changing ideas. People come across a new customer, and the customer says, "But I want this. I want some new feature," and all of a sudden, before you know, it's been sold, and now it's a real thing that's being sold, but it's not in the code yet. And that's an example of model drift, right? The ambient world is changing, and the code has to catch up. And so you look at all these patterns that DDD has evolved, like the bounded context and the aggregate, different layers of encapsulation, which are all attempts to kind of give us a chance at limiting the blast radius of those changes in the code, because we need to take time to change it. And I think, to sort of unwind that back to what I was talking about, we had this business and we had all these different customers, and they had different terms for the same concepts. And then we found out actually they weren't quite the same concepts. They were subtly different, and it's like, how do you reckon with that? So I wrote this talk about when customers don't share a language. And it also inspired this idea for this, for a tool I've been working on called Contextive, which is designed to provide some support for teams who are wrestling with this. It's a way of documenting a glossary, but a context-aware glossary that supports the same terms having different meanings depending on which part of the business or code base you're working in. And it kind of supports you by embedding it into the places where you're working. And we'll talk a bit more about what all that means as we go. But yeah, this is, kind of weaved through there a little bit my history and how it's led me to here and talking about language, business languages and living languages.
So, Chris, given your generosity, here's a QR code in the stream. You can actually get Contextive trial for 6 months for free from Chris. It's a special link for the loosely coupled audience.
Mhm.
So go ahead, scan it, and play around with the tool. It should be interesting. We'll probably dive a little into the tool later in the stream as we go deeper into the living language. And for those wondering, what the hell are we talking about in terms of domain-driven design and ubiquitous language and whatnot? So some literature for that. So ubiquitous design, it stems from this lovely book. I believe that was, 2004 or something like that?
2003, yeah.
2003. So this is Domain-Driven Design, Tackling Complexity in the Heart of Software by Eric Evans. And of course, since the so-called Blue Book, in Poland, this is the red book, actually, because the Polish edition has a different cover. Since the Blue Book, we had so many more books on domain-driven design for various angles, various perspectives, etc. So if you're the book by Eric Evans is quite difficult to read at times for a lot of people. So if you want to really learn something about domain-driven design and get the easier start into domain-driven design, you can also look up Learning Domain-Driven Design by Vlad Kononov. It's a much simpler language to dive into the concepts. And then from this one, you can jump into the book by Eric Evans and learn the more complex aspects in a little bit more difficult language. But this is where ubiquitous language or the living language comes from, in essence, as a term. And so what is the ubiquitous language?
Okay, yeah, so I alluded it to before, but it's great. Thanks for pulling me back on focus. So the idea of the ubiquitous language is the recognition that, it's in the subtitle of Eric's book, Tackling Complexity in the Heart of Software, is that the complexity in our software is not so much the technical complexity, obviously interacting with a database or an API or keeping systems up and reliable. Like there's an element of complexity there, but that's not the core complexity that DDD is interested in. DDD is interested in the domain complexity, the business rules, the business logic, the flow of processes in the business. And Eric sort of recognized that a key element of making that manageable by software engineers is the language that's used. And you've probably worked in a team where the business sort of comes in, or someone representing the business. I don't really like using the phrase "the business" because I think we're all part of the business, But someone representing the needs of the business, say, comes along and starts saying, "Oh, we need it to do the widget in the doohickey and the blah 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 blah," and the engineers just hear this sort of like stream of gobbledygook, and so they start saying, "Okay, yep, all right, well, we'll create a database record and we'll set up an API," and they start talking the language they know, which is all these technical terms, and you have this like complete failure to communicate. And I've seen this happen where people come into a software team and they think they know what everything means because, I've seen the word order before, I've seen the word customer before, I know what a customer is, I know what an order is, I know what a transaction is. And then like maybe a year later you find out, in this business there's something unique going on with that, it's actually different. And so Eric sort of said this terminology is critical. Like it's actually at the heart of understanding, how do we know what the thing has to do? We know because we've read something or we've had a conversation with someone, and that's used words, and those words have attempted to impart to us some understanding of what this software has to do. And so if we don't understand what the words mean and how they're being used, we're completely adrift. So a big part of the book is about like domain modeling, and a part of that is understanding the language. And so the ubiquitous language is the idea that we need to pin it down. Because as malleable and free flowing and like flexible as human conversation is, software needs to just work, and you need to write it. It needs to be unambiguous. And so a lot of elements of DDD are about like making active design decisions. So this is an interesting thing. I quite like the idea of like this phrase we use, domain discovery. We do event storming or domain storytelling or maybe residuality or something to try and discover the domain. And I like this phrase, but I also think it misleads people a little bit, because it leads you to think that the domain is like a mountain range, and you just have to go out there and discover it. You have to just sort of like plow along and map it out and get your measurement instruments and say, oh, it's this high here and it's this high there and this far between these 2 points, and you're discovering it, right? You're an explorer who's discovering the domain. It's not like that in reality, because every person in a company has a different vision of what it is and how it works. And so you are discovering, but you're also co-creating and co-designing as much as you're discovering, I think, at the same time. And I think ubiquitous language and a domain model is the result of that kind of co-creation, in that what you're saying is, I have all these possibilities, all these different ways of looking at it. This is the one we're going to actually build. This is the thing that's going to come into being when we write this software. And so the ubiquitous language is a part of that. It's the definitions of the terminology and how the terminology is used. And it's an encouragement to everybody to use those words in your code, and to use those words in your conversations, and to use those words in your tickets and your story writing. And if you detect people not using those words, take that seriously, because it might mean that you've misunderstood something and that the code needs to change or the model needs to change. There's a great phrase in there.
Or you have a different problem domain.
Potentially, yeah. But there's this great phrase, a change in the language is a change in the model. And I like, I always go back to this, because it kind of like hints at this idea that the language is the way that humans explain models to each other. So we need to understand it.
Now, I'm gonna slightly rephrase and simplify all that you said in terms of the to just show the importance of the language. So let's assume we have a company that does not know the concept of DDD and does not use ubiquitous language. What happens there? Especially if you look at the old school traditional waterfall-like project management and project work. So, okay, we have the business. Whoever runs the business sells something, creates a product, whatever. That business, for example, tells the business analyst that, well, we need to support our business with an IT system. Okay, so the business analyst sits down, tries to model this in BPMN, tries to figure out what the business process is, tries to figure out what are the interactions between different teams, different departments, different customers, and how it executes the product. And then the business analyst talks to the architect. The architect then translates whatever that business analyst gives him into some sort of a design architecture change, whatever that may be in that context. And then the architect tells the dev team what to do by handing them a high-level design, low-level design, and just telling implement this. So between the business and the dev team, and further the testers and the users at the end of it, we have 5 translations, something
At
about
least.
that. At least, yeah, because that on the same level, multiple translations may happen at the same time, parallel, right?
Yeah.
So we have 5 translations. So at least 5 translations, at least 5 times where we can weave in assumptions that we assume that we know what they mean. Because we don't share the common dictionary. That's why they still going to be assumptions. And usually those assumptions, language-wise, are not tested and checked if they're accurate and true.
Yeah.
Right? So in that sense, while already designing and building software in that kind of relationship of this kind of cascade, we're already introducing a lot of errors and bugs into everything, because we assume we know what the business wants and needs. And to just differentiate, wants and needs is completely 2 different things usually. Right? So we basically do not deliver something that is actually of value.
Yeah. I mean, you just described like the, canonical or historical, waterfall model. And I think, to an extent, I'm not going to say that the sole cause of problems in that model is the lack of a clear language, because there's many other problems with that model, but certainly it doesn't help. And I think that, if we look at how the industry is trying to tackle this stuff these days, there's a lot more focus on feedback loops and iterations at each of those transition points, and trying to sort of shorten the lead time from idea to delivery. But you see a huge spectrum of ways in which this is tackled across the industry, from companies that are still operating in that kind of waterfall model through to companies that are shipping ideas to production 20 times a day, and everything in between, and companies that are claiming to be agile but still running like 4-week waterfall sprints. Like it's a whole spectrum. So I'm
Agile
not going to
waterfall.
say that like getting getting the language right is going to fix all the problems, but I certainly think it can help. But I think there's a key point there as well, which we're going to be talking about, I guess, which is that those feedback loops are how you learn the language, right? Like when I look at things like event storming. So if you're not familiar with event storming, it's something that evolved in the DDD community. Alberto Brandolini came up with it, and it's a very visual modeling tool. Like, you have a bunch of people sitting in a room, putting sticky notes up on a wall, trying to map out a process. It's deliberately loose notation as opposed to BPMN or UML, because you want to make it inclusive for people outside the engineering team to be able to participate. And one of the things I love about it is that it gives you these fast feedback loops, because the engineers can participate and they can say, is this what you meant? And people can look at it and understand and say, no, that's not quite what I meant. And they can shuffle the sticky notes around very quickly and sort of get to a point where there's coherence and consensus on what's actually meant. So, a lot of these things are about, when you look at them systemically, they're about feedback loops, shortening those cycles, providing ways for people to check their understanding. Yeah, there's a great picture of an event storm in action. You got all these sticky notes. And it's funny, I do a lot of event storming for companies, and they ask me what to do with the roll of butcher's paper at the end. And I say, roll it up, put it in the corner. You're probably never going to look at it again. Because the reality is, if you come back 3 weeks later and look at it, it's not going to make any sense. It's more like working memory for the group, like a collective working memory as you're having these discussions, and you come to some decisions, and then you move on.
Well, you can take pictures and translate this to BPMN later,
if you want to.
I mean, I've seen that happen, just to document it and make it something tangible that you can work on.
Well, you can come back to it and refresh your memory and things, but what I usually find is that after the fact, when you get into the details, things change again. But it gives you a direction, gives you some coherency to start with. The one thing I definitely don't recommend is having a bunch of people in a room, creating an event storming thing, mapping that into a document diagram, and then giving that to the developers and saying, build this, when the developers weren't part of the event storm in the first place.
Don't do that.
Exactly. Like, the whole point is that it's about like real-time sharing of knowledge and gaining of understanding. And part of that is learning how to speak the language of the business and the domain, so that you can engage meaningfully in understanding what's actually needed.
That's very true. And yes, well, event storming from Alberto Brandolini is a powerful tool. Not the only one there for these kind of discussions about living language and actually building that kind of living language. I know that personally, when I go to a new client, I first ask a lot of questions about the meanings of words, acronyms, etc. Because as an integration architect, I'm not in a very specific industry, because that's a very cross-industry role. So I tend to land at various industries, which means that not only am I at a disadvantage that I don't know the industry, each client will have a different language. And then also the problem is that some of the clients will have a language that is a mix of actual human languages. So they're not purely using English, for example, or not purely using Polish. They actually have a jargon composed of, let's say, Polish and English words, or most of the jargon is actually only Dutch. And then there's some other problems, and that's a challenge. Yeah.
And you see organizations these days where you got developers who speak one language, you got business stakeholders who speak another language, you got customers who speak yet another language, and this, so I think it is worth being clear when we talk about business languages. I'm not as much talking about like human languages like English, French, Spanish, Polish, whatever. We're talking more about the jargon and terminology of the company, which may encompass one or more sort of human languages. I think there's another subtle distinction, which is when you are dealing with customers who have different terminology. And I was working with a client the other day who sort of was framing their problem as a translation problem between like English and French and Spanish. And actually, when we dug into it, it turns out it wasn't so much a translation problem, but more of a representation problem, because it was more about representing their core concepts into the regulatory environments of those countries. So it's actually more of a market. They're selling their product into multiple markets, and each market has a different need. Those markets happen to be in different countries which speak different human languages, but more fundamentally was the fact that it was a different regulatory market in each environment. And that was like, how do we adapt our core concepts into these markets? And I think that even be like in America, they might even need different terminology, even though it's still English compared to the UK.
And by that, you basically then have 3 separate problem domains.
Yeah, but that's not commercially viable, right, to build the product 3 or 4 times. So they're trying to find a common abstraction and give that a terminology that can be like an internal private language, and then a representation of that into each of the markets. And a lot of businesses are dealing with this kind of stuff. Global adaptation is a problem I see all over the place. But at least starting to get a grip on what your language is and within which boundaries the terminologies apply is incredibly helpful.
It is. So that said, now that we know what the living language is, or what ubiquitous language is, then how does that language precisely influence design? And in that sense, we already have a good question in chat for this. I think that's a pretty decent one, right?
Yeah.
So if we're at startup scale or under constant product pressure, and this is exactly what startups really get right now, there's constant product pressure. So what's the minimum viable practice to safely move forward with a ubiquitous or living language? What's the minimum we need to do to get started? Because of course, if it's a living language and we're constantly evolving the problem domain and the business, that means that the language will evolve as well, because we're growing, we're making new things, we're adding products, etc., or variations to the products or functions. So this will definitely grow.
Yeah.
But being a startup, so being a small company, means that we're basically starting small, and this is a good point to already start introducing that ubiquitous language.
Yeah, so I'm going to call out something here, because we've been using the terms ubiquitous language and living language kind of interchangeably, and the truth is that they're not, because a lot of companies treat the ubiquitous language as like a fixed thing. You go through a whole bunch of effort, you maybe get a consultant in, you spend 6 months documenting your glossary, and then you file it away somewhere, and then now that's it. And I think the reason we're using the phrase living languages is because I'm trying to advocate for people to recognize the fact that the context is evolving, and you need to treat it as an evolving and a living language. But to more precisely answer that question, which is a great question, like what are the minimum like practices you'd insist on in the early days of a startup or a scale up? You're not only are you under constant product pressure, but you're operating in an environment of intense uncertainty. You don't know if the product you're currently building is going to be the one that's going to be successful. You don't know how many more pivots you're going to have. There's often a lot of reluctance to overinvest in consolidating or concretizing things until there's clarity. One of the things that I think is these days something you cannot avoid in that space, and a lot of people still do defer it, is testing and quality management, because people say, "Oh, I'm not going to worry about tests because we don't even know if this thing's going to be successful." But the truth is that it's not that the thing you're building may or may not be successful, but some variation of it or some adaptation of it might be the thing that ends up becoming successful. So you're going to have to change it, but you're going to have to keep some parts of it working correctly. And we used to live in a world of like move fast and break things. Now we live in a world where you have to move fast and not break things, because all of the companies that got to do the moving fast and the breaking things grew up. They created an expectation of reliability that any new startup these days need to match. So I'm a big believer in starting early with like quality harnesses, not over like boiling the ocean with it, but at least giving you some protection so that when you do need to evolve and change it, you can do it freely and with confidence. Because what I often see is startups that don't do that because they're trying to justify, we don't want to overinvest, we don't know if it's going to be valid or not, then they do get some traction. They have to start adapting what they've been doing to react to market feedback, and they're scared to change the system because they've got no quality control around it. And so what they end up doing is trying to stuff these new ideas into old models. And I was guilty of this. My first startup was a lunch ordering service for schools, and then along they came and said, now we want to sell uniforms to the schools as well, and we got to start doing it in 2 weeks. And I was like, well, I've already got like this whole infrastructure for like taking orders and paying them out and just like sending the data to the people fulfilling the orders, so let's just use that. So we ended up with the same records that were tracking like the presence of a slice of cheese on a sandwich, tracking the size of a t-shirt for a kid at a school. And it kind of worked, but it kind of didn't either. Like it worked, but there was all this friction around it, because as we got closer to that space and we looked at the difference between lunches and uniforms, they had different life cycles of the orders, different payment schedules, different fulfillment timeframes, different configuration and customization needs for the different products in those catalogs. And that's been like, there was a real burden ever after. And if I'd had, I think, maybe a little bit more confidence to just introduce some new concepts into that system, and not feeling like, I had to just reuse what was already there, we might have ended up with a more flexible system. But we shoved everything in the same model because it's what we had and we didn't have time to change it. And we didn't have confidence to change it because of the lack of sort of quality control around it as well. So so to answer the question, I'm a big believer in starting early with some more automated quality testing, continuous delivery practices, things like that actually give you the freedom to evolve. And then on top of that, when you talk about the minimum viable DDD and ubiquitous language practice, it is this idea of constantly evolving order. So in Eric Evans' Blue Book, he uses this phrase, evolving order of the large-scale system, because he recognizes that the design you come up with at the start is the design that you build when you least understand the domain. So you're going to have a much greater understanding of the domain over time. You need to be evolving the system over time as you build that understanding. And so I think practices like continuous delivery and quality management, automated quality testing, practices that permit the continuous evolution of the design. And that continuous evolution of the design, as you learn more about the domain, is the key to keeping technical debt low and keeping the speed up as you sort of start to pivot and adjust and adapt to market feedback. So yeah, there's a lot of ideas in there, but I think this is important stuff.
Well, from my personal experience, looking at how companies with product teams, and actually the core IT is focused around the product, how they work, is one thing that goes into play is also a little bit of strategic thinking that is usually lacking, because a lot of the decisions are really tactical. And if you do only tactical decisions, then you end up with implicit architecture and implicit language, I would assume, as well. So you imply that you know the language, but in fact you didn't even bother to learn it and properly manage it and evolve it, which then means that probably parts of your ecosystem, they speak a completely different language.
Yeah.
Though the words are completely the same, but the understandings are not mapped out, and then you have that semantic sprawl of a model, and this is where things drift away. And
what you're talking to,
those tactical decisions will then cost later, simply.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point you raise about strategic versus tactical thinking. I think I have a complicated relationship with this, because I think strategy and strategic thinking is important, but I also think that just because you've created a strategy doesn't mean it's the right strategy, and doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be subject to the same pressure to evolve and change over time, right? But I think
it needs to be iterative always.
Yeah, but I think that there's an interesting, you talk about languages not being considered. One phenomenon I do see a lot as well is like languages that get baked into the technology, which have been created by the developers without necessarily consulting with other people. You end up with these sort of like specialist jargon terminology that where they've tried to come up with something that's not a technical term, but it really doesn't match with the way anybody else talks or thinks about it. But then that can end up becoming part of the domain. So give you an example, I was talking to some people in the UK. It was a recruitment firm, and I said, give me an example of like a term from your field. Like what's a key terminology thing that you find challenging in your space? And they said Boolean. I was like, I thought I misheard. I'm like, sorry, Boolean? Wait, really? Like, we're talking about recruitment, right? Like, not like fundamental mathematical logic. And they said, no, recruitment.
Boolean.
Like, so, we want a candidate. We want a candidate that has, 10 years experience in React and, university degree or something, or, 20 years working with ChatGPT. So they run what they call a Boolean, which is like, slang for a Boolean search, where they have
Yes.
these criteria and they combine them in like an and or kind of combination to run a search for a candidate. And so the developers of this system called that a Boolean search. And now the word Boolean has become part of the language of this recruitment company, where they say, oh, did you run a Boolean for a candidate? And that's what they say. So the word Boolean is now like code for search, like the way we use Google. And it's fascinating, because it's like, it highlights the fact that language is fluid, and it's not something that developers need to just absorb or discover. As I said, like, it's not a mountain range that's out there that you can find. You do influence it, but you need to do it collaboratively, so that you come up with something that is shared understanding, and it's not just developers driving their misunderstandings into the business, because it affects more than just the code. It becomes like, part of the language of the company, and then that causes problems for every new starter that needs to wrap their heads around what this thing means.
But that's a wonderful example there. Boolean is one of it. We actually talked about Boolean searches when we were doing the live streams on recruitment in IT.
All right, there you go.
Yeah, we actually had a seasoned recruiter on the stream with a owner of a UK. I don't know if it's a startup anymore. It's probably already a really well-grown company. That provides automation for Boolean searches that augments the search with additional criteria based on what you're actually searching for, and then figures what are the additional keywords you might be looking for, because obviously people are limited in the vocabulary of the role by the role definition as presented by the HR or hiring manager. And that's one thing. But just to look at it from a perspective of pure IT, I landed some time ago in a situation where the word integration had a completely different meaning than I would assume.
Must be challenging as an integration architect to
Yeah,
land in this.
so usually when I'm in the context of my field, I simplify and talk about integration, and that means application integration. So APIs, integration platforms, API management, message brokers, all that stuff, right? But unfortunately, somebody also dumped down the term data integration into the word integration. So now we're having the word integration floating around, meaning two completely different things for a set of people. Now, a manager picks up the word integration and he thinks that this word encompasses both fields. And this is the same thing. And the result of such misunderstanding and not caring to the language is that now I have to deal with an integration team, application integration team, that is supposed to be running an integration platform and building one that is composed only from former DBAs. And what's the result of their work? They built a so-called integration platform that is an MDM solution covered around with Azure functions feeding it data. So I was like, yeah, you basically built a very heavy central MDM. No, it's an integration platform. No, you have state in it. Yeah. No, it's an integration platform. No, but integration platforms do not keep state. They are either stateless or with very small state, like, temporary. No, it's an integration platform. Oh. and half year it took me to explain that this is a misconception of terminology, which was then turned into slang, a specific jargon of a company, where they started using the term integration for both fields at the same time, and management picked it up and continued on doing this. And to roll back on these kind of things, it's a horrendous work for an architect who actually understands the difference. It's a lot of work. It's a problem.
And it highlights, I think, one of the interesting things here, which is that, like, languages evolve, but driving change to a language is incredibly hard, because it is it's what is embedded in people's minds, and it's how they communicate every day. And it's going to change, and it's going to have these misconceptions in it. And I think even just the word integration makes me laugh, because I think about, like, there's probably like a dozen other ways in which technologists use the term integration completely incompatibly. You know, whether it's from like integration test, does that mean when two classes are tested at the same time? Whether it's a system and a database, or is it two systems, or is it a front end and a back end? Like, what is an integration test? You could get like a dozen different definitions from people.
Yeah, was it with business data, or are we just testing connectivity? Is it
Yeah.
end to end, or just through one API? What's
And then
going on
you've
there?
got an idea of what an integration platform is. You know, you mentioned it, like stateless, or maybe, you know,
Yeah.
short-term temporary state, but you know, data integration, people think about it a different way. Integration is a great example of a word with like many different meanings. But yeah,
There's
it's funny,
plenty of
like,
words like that.
yeah. And it's actually funny, because in DDD, you know, we've got such a focus on language, but as many people have pointed out over the years, it's also a field in which there's a lot of misconceptions about what many of the words in DDD mean. You know, like whether it's aggregate or bounded context, you get different confusing definitions around it. And I think that, you know, some people say, oh, this is ironic, but I just think it's life, right? It's humanity. It's how we communicate. It's why we've got hundreds of different human languages, because once people are in a group, they develop their own language, their own way of speaking. And in big enough companies, you end up with different dialects across the whole company, even of like what might notionally be the same language. So yeah, it's a fun world to be thinking about.
And then talking about the evolution of language, here's another great question on this one. I don't know why Lucian is promising that this is the last one. Keep going, dude, keep going, keep asking good questions. But yeah, how do you reconcile ubiquitous language with technical constraints in legacy systems? So database schemas, APIs that encode names. A great example of this kind of encoding is the old SAP R3 interfaces, which were all German abbreviations where nobody could understand other than people working on SAP that could actually tell what the hell that was. So yeah, this is and in the modern distributed world, that's even harder, because it's not only about legacy systems and their constraints. A lot of companies just take off-the-shelf SaaS solutions, and each of those SaaS solutions, it has its own jargon, its own language. So if I look at, let's say, a CRM like Salesforce, in Salesforce, I have an opportunity. In SAP, that would constitute a sales order. We already have a huge discrepancy in language. And not even taking into the account that basically then the CRM implements two different domains, because it implements a customer domain and an order domain, and shares that domain across let's say, an integration platform with SAP, which also implements an order domain with its own specific jargon of its subdomain that is SAP. This is then really crazy to comprehend. If you're working on one system, it's probably easy, but then whenever you go outsid of that, the bounds of that system, then you're like, what the hell's going on? What are these words you're talking to me? What do they mean? And this is exactly this kind of a reconciliation of technical constraints. And well, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, so I've got there's two ideas I'm going to introduce here that I think can help with thinking about this. And one is the concept from domain-driven design of the bounded context. And then the other is the idea of a published language. And this relates to sort of traditional notions of encapsulation and what's public and what's private. So in the simplest sense, we're talking about reconciling with a ubiquitous language with technical constraints in a legacy system. So he says, you know, when database schemas or APIs encode historical names, I think we need to think about those very differently. Hopefully the database schema is not public, right?
Hopefully.
Hopefully. I'm not going to say often it is, but you need to understand what part of your system is public. And what do I mean by public? I mean, what part of your system, if you changed it, would break a component owned by another team? Or if you're operating in an environment where you don't have teams that own components and you've just got like project teams that float around, what would, if you changed, would break a component that you're not currently looking at? To me, that's a very practical definition of what's public and what's private. And so what you find sometimes is that things that you thought were private are actually public. Things that you thought were public might actually be private. So sometimes the classic is we thought the database schema was private. Turns out there's another system that's reading from it. It's not private. Classic example is a data pipeline pushing out to a warehouse, right? It's just got a read connection string to your private database.
Yep.
Happens all the time. But in the flip side, another example is people often think that their APIs are public, but actually the APIs are only getting consumed by apps developed by the same company, probably by a team sitting right next to you. So that could conceivably be treated as a private API because changes to it can be more easily managed by just working and collaborating closely with the team that owns the front end. But if you're in a world where your back-end team is in Europe and your front-end team's in America, it probably does need to be treated like a public API. So public and private is critical to understand, like, what elements of your system are public and what are private. Once that's understood, obviously your public system, your public endpoints, whether it's APIs or GraphQL or messages on queues or database schemas, whatever it is, that needs to be kept pretty stable and a managed change process around it so consumers can evolve their consumption of it. But anything other than that, anything private, you should be free to change that whenever you like. And if you've got a good quality harness around it, you should be able to do the internal refactoring, the internal renaming to align it with your ubiquitous language goals. So I've done this quite successfully in a number of places where we've wanted to change the name. We realized we had the wrong name. We executed an internal refactor. We kept the old endpoint. We introduced a side-by-side endpoint for the new name. And then we deprecated the old endpoint once all the consumers had migrated over to the new one. So this is, I think, one way of thinking about it. First step, understand what's public, what's private. What are you going to break if you change things? And then align your private things with ubiquitous language as quickly as you possibly can, and evolve the public things towards the language once you can collaborate with the consumers of it to make that change sensible. Then the second idea,
And now, before you jump to the second idea, it's like you were describing so many things, and in my head goes, context mapping. There we go. That's one of the aspects you were talking about in essence. Public, private, that dives into the context mapping of social technical dependencies as well. Then you have coupling, which is another topic, a very, very, very deep topic in terms of understanding what is private, what is public. Then next to you mentioned published language, which is basically an abstraction layer. So architecturally, you would probably hear Neil Ford or Mark Richards quote that nothing solves an abstraction problem like another abstraction layer. And this is basically what happens. Basically, if you have a published language and you have an AC open host service, that's an abstraction layer that you're managing. So you can have your private parts of the system, and then you have the public part, which is the abstraction layer that you abstract all the changes that are inside. Right, so architecturally speaking, you add abstraction layers to be safe to make those changes safely. And then this basically ties to my work as an architect, where literally an integration platform is yet another abstraction layer, and sometimes even more than one, which again changes drastically the way we consume APIs, consume language, because the integration platform can have its own language.
It can become an anti-corruption layer in a way, like a translation point between different.
That's one of the sole purposes of an integration platform, being an anti-corruption layer to a lot of systems, if implemented right, because it also can be a conformist and conform to everybody, and then it's no longer an ACL. It's just going to be copying the language of another.
And this is how and why you see it becomes so easy for people to just slip. I'm just going to put one little bit of business logic in the integration layer, because it's just, we just need to transform this one field. I just need to multiply it by 2. It's not a big deal. We'll just put that in the integration layer. It's so simple. It's like, that's a business rule. That's a business logic. And now you've lost control of that. And like when that
the control is now moved to the integration platform, and then 2 years later, when you're actually making changes, you have a bug in production and you have no idea where it comes from, and you spend weeks on debugging this and looking for the root cause, and then you end up on the integration platform. Why the hell is there business logic here? And I
classic one is
always
roll-ups. So like, summing line items in order to get to an order total. I've seen that logic in a
oh
integration platform because the back end doesn't give you the total, front end needs the total. Someone puts it into the integration layer or BFF or something like that, and then it's like, but that's not where it belongs, obviously.
no, no.
And because it's a rule. Like, how did you sum that? Does it include taxes? Does it include like, what are the rounding implications? Like, all this stuff needs to be answered, and this is when we talk about DDD, what we're saying is this is core business rules, needs to be very
Yep.
clearly expressed in your code, needs to be clearly expressed in a place where you can find it and change it safely and understand it. And when we say, obviously, it shouldn't be in the integration layer, I really struggle with that word, obviously, because it's obvious to us because we've seen the pain that it causes, but maybe it's not obvious to some people. And so I think
No.
this is why we want to be really explicit and clear about why we say it shouldn't be there, because this is the stuff that is embodying what's important to your company. Your company doesn't care, I guarantee it does not care if you're using REST or GraphQL. But
No.
it does care if your order totals don't add up because the tax isn't calculated correctly. Like, that's important. And that's the difference between the domain concerns and the technical concerns. One of the first talks I gave about DDD, I introduced it with that meme of like two wolves. And I said, inside you, there's two wolves, one with a focus on the domain and one with a focus on the technology. And as technologists, our technology wolf is really loud and aggressive and wants, because it's what we love about stuff, right? That's why we got into it. But we need to like strengthen our wolf with a domain focus, and we need to understand both. Like, they're both important, but it's the domain focused wolf is the one that I see in a lot of technology people is underdeveloped and sort of quietly crying in the corner while the technology focused wolf is sort of dominating things.
And I get asked quite a few times. I'm not a DDD expert, but I do utilize DDD tools to explain things and visualize things and show stakeholders. And sometimes people, especially techies, ask me, "Why should I care?" Right? And it's like, yeah, well, why should you care? Is okay. You're a specialist in a specific framework, technology, whatever.
Yep.
Great. What are you with that framework or technology without the business hiring you? You do art. It's not science, it's not engineering, it's art. Because your code then does not have any purpose. As a developer, dev team, architect, solution designer, whatever the name of the role is in tech, if you're hired by a company, your role is to facilitate the business. So you're always in a business context. And this is why that domain wolf should be more developed every single time you can, because otherwise you're useless to business because you're just another techie.
Yeah. And it's interesting, when I look at the world of startups, this is why I see a lot of technology, like startups that are led by technologists are building startups for technologists, right? Because that's the domain they know. I'm going to launch a new database service. I'm going to build a cloud hosting platform. I'm going to build a new integration layer. I'm going to build an event-driven architecture thing. Or like me, I'm going to build a ubiquitous language documentation tool, right? Because that's the domain I've lived in. That's what I know. If you want to do anything else for anybody who's not just like you as a customer, you need to collaborate with people who are like the customer, and you need to really get into and understand their world. So one of the things we used to do at our startup was we used to send everybody out to a school kitchen, and they would make sandwiches for a day and spend the day in there making sandwiches, serving the kids lunch, so that they could understand, like, what is the impact our software is having and who are we doing it for and why are we doing it for them. And not every company can do that level of engagement, but I think at least having some understanding of who your customer is, like how does your business make money? So this is actually a really good thing to do with you doing event storming. And sometimes, like, we get to the end of the day and everyone's tired. We've done this whole big events, things like 8-meter wall, hundreds of sticky notes
or more.
And I look at the whole thing and I go, okay, so where do you make money? Like, where does the money come into your company along this wall? Because that's actually the thing. Everyone should be able to answer instantly. They should be able to say, that's the point where we make money. Everything before that helps us get to this point. And if we don't get to that, if we start this journey and we don't get to that point, that's wasted effort. And everything after that is to help the loop that brings us back around to that point on the next sales cycle or the next month or the next year happen again. Because it's oxygen. Like, we sometimes, like, people will talk about requirements analysis, right? I'm very cynical about this. I love Udi de Haan's phrase. He says, every requirement is a workaround in disguise. Because what's happening is someone has hit a problem and they've said, I'm going to solve this problem with the tools and knowledge that I have. And then I'm going to give my solution and ask the engineers to implement my solution. And how many times have you got a ticket in Jira that says, add this column to the database? It's like, is that a requirement? Really? Like, that's not a requirement.
No, that's the solution.
That's the solution. So, but sometimes it's more subtle than that. It's like, add this field to the form. Or we had one which was like, oh, the UI is too slow. We need to be able to enter this data more quickly. And then when we dug into it, but why do you want to do that? Oh, it turns out that they had someone sitting there who's punching in like 1,000 records a day, transcribing it from a spreadsheet. So we said, what if we built you a spreadsheet import? And they went, you could do that? They didn't even know that was possible. So it wasn't part of their tool set. They didn't say our requirement is to be able to import 1,000 of these in an hour. They just said, make the screen faster. So what's the real requirement there? You got to dig into like, what problem are they trying to solve? The reason I bring that up is because every time you go peel back one layer of the onion, there's always another layer. Why are you trying to import 1,000 a day? Oh, because that's our throughput. Why is that? Oh, that's our quarterly OKR. Like what's the why? You keep asking why. You peel back enough layers of the onion, the answer is always because our company needs to make more money in the next quarter than we're going to spend on salaries. Like, that's it. That's the same answer for every company. So what's different about the companies is the way that they've answered that question along the hierarchy of cause and effect down to you adding this column to the database. And I'm not saying everyone needs to understand every link in the chain, but an interesting thing is that the more layers you unpeel, the more likely you're going to do something that is treated as innovative. Because innovation is really like pushing one layer up the chain and doing something that nobody else thought of to solve the same problem in a different way, or solve a hidden problem that people didn't even realize they had, like the root cause problem that they were like really wrestling with. That becomes innovation. Like, so in a way,
we literally had a talk about this. What was it? December, I think, with Woody Zool.
He's great. Love Woody.
So Woody was talking that a lot of people treat symptoms, not problem.
100%.
And then the solutions are symptomatic. They're not fixing any problem, because we're just putting a big band-aid on a huge gaping wound, which doesn't help the wound. We just fix one small symptom. Instead, there should be signals to ask questions and dig deeper into what the actual problem is. And I took a book at my desk. I have too many books around me, but basically this one is actually lying on the desk. This is, if somebody wants to look it up, this is this lovely book, Domain-Driven Refactoring. And this phrase I have on page 23 of this book is actually not anything around domain-driven design or refactoring itself. So I'm going to quote here. We tend to seek to try and find a solution as quickly as possible and leave the problem space as quickly too. We are uncomfortable staying in this area, but it is where our client needs to reside. It is the zone that allows us to acquire more information about the problems of our clients, about the problems our clients ask us to solve through the software we will develop for them, because writing software means solving business problems. And this is also this is not only a cardinal sin of developers, architects, solution designers, UX designers, or whatnot. This is also a cardinal sin of the business itself, because and that stems from a variety of things. One of it being just pure psychology and or bad management, for example, because I've seen a lot of managers just stating, do not come to me with problems, come to me with solutions. So people, instead of diving into the problem space, they're diving into the solution space, and they want to get out of the problem as quickly as possible, because otherwise they'll be in trouble.
Yeah, 100%. It's a big issue. It's a cultural thing in a lot of companies, isn't it? And in those same companies, I guarantee you, there's like, if you really wanted to understand, like, when was the last time that anyone spoke to a customer with a view of trying to actually understand what would make their life better? It could have been like years ago, right? You probably have a lot of customer service representatives speaking to customers every day. They would have a lot of insights into what problems the customers are facing, but they're never invited to have these conversations. Every time I run an event storm for a client, I say, make sure you bring some people from customer service or customer success, people that actually talk to your customers every day, make sure they're in the room. And every single time without fail, they say something that absolutely shocks the rest of the people in the room. It's inevitable.
That's very true, because at times if you get that kind of bubble silo, then you have something like a CTO-driven development or a CPO-driven development,
Or
and it's the idea
resume-driven
of the
development is the classic.
I love resume-driven development. I want to learn Kafka, so let's put Kafka into the solution.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. Way to overcomplicate your solution years ahead, right? And you're going to be solving the problems that stem from Kafka, not from the problem space that you're in, because somebody got them introduced Kafka, and it just will not work because you're not Netflix.
Don't get me started on Kafka. That's a whole nother live stream topic, I think.
Okay. But pitch idea for the future. I'm going to invite you and somebody from Solace, and we're going to talk about Kafka, because they love the topic of Kafka.
Awesome.
All right.
I just realized we rambled a bit, because there was a second part of answering Lucian's question before, which was we talked about public and private, but the second part is the concept of a bounded context. And so I think that if you are in a world where you've got a legacy component and you're not able to change it, you've got these technical constraints, then you need to recognize that the ubiquitous language is not intended to be something that's applied universally across the whole software system. A very valid solution is to say this legacy stuff is its own bounded context, and each bounded context gets its own language. And so then you can create new bounded contexts, design new bounded contexts, and craft a new language in those bounded contexts which suits the current needs. And yeah, you're going to have some adaptations, some anti-corruption layers, or some integration between them. But over time, hopefully you can migrate customers into just using the new components. And that's one way to sort of absorb or like dissolve the legacy stuff. It's a complex space, sort of legacy modernization. But don't feel like you can't adopt the concept of a ubiquitous language because you've got legacy code. There are some patterns to help deal with it. And one of them is this idea of a bounded context, where you say this legacy stuff is its own bounded context. In that bounded context, these words have this meaning. These are not the words we prefer to use in this part of the code, which is a different bounded context. And so the idea of a bounded context is literally a strict boundary around a context. Context is what gives words meaning. When we talk about the fact that words have many different meanings, like you said before, the word integration, how do you know which meaning applies? The answer is context. What's the context of the conversation? In what context were people talking about integration? If they're talking in the context of speaking to a data engineer, they're talking about data integration. If they're context of speaking to you, they're talking about application integration. Context is critical. So this is actually why the word bounded context gets its name. It's actually why my tool is called Contextive as well, because it's about context-aware definitions. Particularly with large language models, we're seeing people become suddenly very interested in context, because context is what helps drive the probability equations in these large language models. So I think bounded context is a really powerful tool to help tackle that kind of situation as well. Hopefully that helps.
And then of course, if you through this kind of pondering, you identify a bounded context, or through event storming, you start of identifying different bounded contexts, because if you do event storming, that's a natural outcome of it, that you actually find some domains and bounded contexts. Then if you have this kind of legacy system, you can always put a open host service or an ACL in front of it that will just serve as a translation layer from whatever language it has to the agreed language of the problem domain that you're having, so that you can do it. And you can do that in all sorts of forms. You can just put an API layer on top of it, one way to do it. You can put an integration platform in front of it. Integration platforms are great ACLs, so that will work as well. It really depends on so many factors. What is the scale of your business? How many systems you have? How much of a throughput you have? How much knowledge you have about that system, or none at all, and you just see the interfaces and it's a black box, etc., etc. So by that, you can choose a way to mitigate that and just run it and test it and see if it works. If it doesn't work, then find a different way to mitigate the influence of that language. But basically, you need some sort of anyways, you will need some sort of an anti-corruption layer. So we're back to the architectural concept of an abstraction between that legacy system and something else that you're building.
Yeah.
And what kind of abstraction you provide, what kind of boundary you provide, Some organizations just separate that to entirely new environments that are completely isolated. Can do. Some just utilize translation, and that works as well. And it really depends on what is the actual situation you're in.
Absolutely. But this idea of bounded context actually reminds. So you asked a question a while ago about how does the language affect the design. I think we've taken some rambling twists and turns since then. But this idea of the bounded context is a critical one for that, because I think that there are many different heuristics or like rules of thumb for how to find bounded context boundaries. But one of the ones that I really like is looking at the language. And if you find that you've got a different set of terms that are frequently used together, or the same word that you sort of managed to hear, oh, hang on, sometimes you use this word and you seem to mean this thing, and sometimes you use the same word but you seem to mean something else, that can uncover actually these two things are in different bounded contexts. And that's why, because humans, they don't give you a nice label to say, oh, I'm switching contexts now. People will jump between 10 different contexts in the same conversation, because we're actually naturally very context aware, and we know what context things are by inference. I've been collecting funny examples of the same term having very different meanings, and one of my favorites is the word theatre, because that has a very different meaning if you're talking about the context of a play versus the context of a surgery. So you got surgery theatre and you got a playhouse theatre. But if you say the patient is in the theatre, from context that you're talking about a surgical theatre. Whereas you say the actor's running late to the theatre, you're talking about a playhouse theatre. So we as humans know from the implicit context of the language, what context we're talking about. And you can be talking to business stakeholders; they will jump between contexts like nobody's business. And so I think there's a bit of it's actually a problematic heuristic when people say, oh, you just need to talk to, you can model your bounded context or your domains based on departments in the company. I've very rarely found that to be effective, because, those departments in the company are usually driven by politics and other kind of non-opt or suboptimal sort of design strategies. And you will find people in those departments that kind of very naturally shuffle between contexts, without really batting an eyelid. But as system designers, we need to really tease these things apart and understand, hang on, use this word in this. Oh yeah, well, when I meant that, I meant this thing, but when I said it later, I meant this other thing. You need to make that explicit and draw it out from these conversations. Yeah. And so this is one of the ways that language drive the design, by listening closely to it.
Yeah, it needs to be more deterministic when we do design, because language itself is not that deterministic in a sense, because it's fluid. The meanings are fluid. The same word may mean so many things, even in just plain language. And just given I've been talking to my team today, and my team is composed of multiple nationalities, and we were talking about learning the Dutch language, right? And Dutch language has multiple commonalities with Polish language. The same words phonetically, meaning-wise, also the same at times. So the word like smaak means taste, and it's just written a little bit differently in Dutch, and a little bit differently in Polish means exactly the same thing. Kraan meaning a tap for water, same thing. But kraan in Dutch may mean also a completely different thing, for example. And we're already semantically lost there, right? But then there are words that are phonetically the same, but semantically they're completely different. And I'm not going to say them out loud here, but basically we joked about certain words that are regular words in Dutch. So, for example, the word peanuts in Dutch, it's a normal word. In Polish, it's an actually offensive slur. So to that extent, right? And the way people say good morning, or the part good in the phrase good morning in the Netherlands, in not exactly proper Dutch, but the slang Dutch, it's actually also a dirty word in Polish, right? So it's like I'm going to a kindergarten, and the teachers in the kindergarten greet me with the slang version of good morning, and I'm like cracking up inside, because it has a different semantic meaning for me.
Mm.
And this is, in terms of the ubiquitous language and banded context, it's all about that semantic meaning of things.
Yeah.
And it will always be in that sense.
And this is the thing, where it's a very challenging task we've set ourselves as engineers, is to like take this fluid, amorphous, constantly evolving human language and pin it down to something that we can write some software around, whilst at the same time writing that software in such a way that we can change the software as the language evolves around it, or come up with an architecture that's going to be resilient to the kind of changes that might happen. You know, as people like Barry O'Reilly are talking about with residuality. So, you know, there's a lot of, like, it's hard work, right? Like, there's no easy solutions.
Extremely difficult.
And actually, this is one of the reasons why, you know, like when we talk about language, and, you know, we've kind of been edging towards this topic, so I might as well bring it up. But when we talk about context, you know, like inevitably when I talk about this, people start bringing up the topic of large language models. Like, you know, are they making this easier? Are they making it harder? Like, what impact are they having on this space? And, you know, I have a particular view on it, which is maybe a little bit more cynical than some other people's. But it's basically like language models are able to capture one specific set of facts about language, which is what's called the denotational semantics. So that's the idea that these tokens are found frequently with each other in a corpus of text, probabilistically speaking. That does encode a certain level of meaning. And that meaning becomes like apparent when you have conversations with like ChatGPT and things. You know, you can kind of see, oh, it seems to understand me, or it seems to be able to make sense of what I'm talking about. But also, as I'm sure many people have seen, like that sometimes breaks down, you get hallucinations. And hallucinations are quite confusing when you first encounter them, but when you understand that it's just, you know, you've got a sequence of tokens, you've got a complex network of probabilities deciding what is the next likely token. Those probabilities are ranked, and then a random number generator chooses one of the most likely, but not necessarily always the most likely. And you realize, well, this is where they come from. We just randomly sometimes pick a token further down the list, which actually happens to have a very different semantic. And then that token becomes part of the context, which then drives the probabilities of the next token, and it sort of goes off course, and you end up with these like complete fabrications of like, you know, things that are just completely confusing to people. And I think this is a real problem. So you know, I'm not saying that people are not getting value out of them, but as someone who cares about precision in language and meaning, I'm very distrustful of letting or delegating the creation of my glossary definitions to a large language model. I think you're going to get something that is very plausible on the surface, but is going to be subtly different from what your business actually needs. What you're going to get is sort of like the statistical average of the text that's out there on the internet, not necessarily the way your company talks about it. So I think it's something that needs to be very carefully considered by a human and checked with other humans to make sure it makes sense, people who are actual experts in the domain. Because if you're not an expert in the domain, I'm going on about this a bit because people have been looking at my tool Contextive, and they've been saying, oh, we're going to get an LLM to create our glossary. And I'm like, if you don't get a human to check it, you're going to just be, you might as well not have a glossary, right? Like you're operating in la la land. So it's a bit of a bugbear for me, to be honest.
but now you brought you said a phrase that I recall from your conversation from a different stream, and I think you know which stream I mean, about an LLM being a game master, dungeon master for RPG sessions. Now, I think this is in that sense of understanding the concept. Why is it not exactly going to be that precise? It's a very good example why that LLM will not be a good game master. And for that extent, I really tried. I did create a specific chatbot on my Gemini account, and I provided it with a lot of context for a specific story-driven RPG that I wanted to play, and tried to play. I ended up spending 4 hours chatting with Gemini, just playing along and figuring out. Interesting, but and now here's your opinion on that. Can you restate that for the stream, because that was a very interesting one. Why an LLM would not be a great dungeon master?
So I remember the stream you're talking about. I was chatting to a guy who runs a gaming podcast, and we were talking about large language models in the context of game development and games. And we were using the concept of a large language model as a dungeon master because in computer games, I think one of the hypotheses is that you're going to get like more dynamic game narratives being created on the fly by large language models. And I think that, you know, my view on it is that because of the fact that large language models are drawing from a corpus of text, they're looking at probabilities. And as an individual user, you're engaging with a single set of outputs based on the inputs you've provided, the context you provided. When you look at like a set of all the possible answers that are coming out, you don't see as much variability as you might expect. So what you're seeing really actually is stuff that's kind of lifted from text that's been sort of from the internet. You don't tend to see stuff that's actually innovative or creative. However, it might appear creative to you because you're not familiar with the source material. If you're not familiar with where it got the stuff from, you're going to think, oh, this thing's really creative. It just came up with this stuff. But actually, it probably lifted it from something that it kind of, you know, it was in its training data, legally or illegally. Another conversation. So, you know, my view on it, I think that they're not going to make a very good one because I don't think they're going to be very creative. I think that you're going to get, like, it's going to get boring over time. It's going to be repetitive. But that said, I've spoken to people who've found a lot of satisfaction in engaging with large language models in this way. You know, they found it perfectly satisfying for their needs. So, you know, I don't want to tell them that they're not having fun when they tell me they're having fun. But I think that, you know, it's not going to replace genuine human creativity. And in the context of what we're talking about, crafting glossaries for businesses, I think there's a real risk that it creates another way for engineers to avoid talking to domain experts. You know, it's like get out of jail card. Oh, you mean I have to have this conversation, or I can just ask Gemini to create a glossary for me? I'm like, no, just have the conversation. You'll appreciate it. You will engage with the human being who actually works in the space. You'll learn something that you won't learn from the large language model.
On that note of language and large language models, when I played it when I worked with the Gemini chatbot that I created as a game master, there was a risk that I wasn't aware of that actually popped out instantly in the game that I was playing, is that depending on the model, the models are some models, especially those that are chatbot models, are very agreeable. So there was absolutely no instance in the story I was playing that my character failed at something. Whereas in a normal game, you just throw a dice and you roll a natural one, and I'm screwed. Here, I was always successful. Whatever I said, it goes.
Some people,
it was just so successful. Of course, yeah,
that's
true.
fantasy, right?
But that doesn't create the level of
tension,
etc.
Yeah.
But that brings a very dangerous thing in terms of also language and building the language, because that means that each model that you didn't train yourself has built in guardrails and guidelines. Now, there was a very interesting conversation I had in the office some time ago with one of our colleagues who was actually working on AI ethics. And they were pondering about use cases of AI for public institutions such as police. And they were pondering on specific types of crime, some of which are very serious, and I'm not going to name specifics, but, well, not exactly the nice ones. And they were pondering on use cases, and AI, in this instance, that was the lovely one attached to the collaborative tools, was recording the meeting, transcribing it, and making summaries. So after the meeting, they received a summary from that particular LLM, and suddenly they realized that 2/3 of the meeting was completely erased from the summary. They checked the transcript, it was absolutely there. They checked the summary, nope, nothing. Why? Because that particular LLM had built-in guidelines and guardrails not to process that kind of information and instantly reject that as input. And now, if we try to utilize LLMs to create a living language for our company, and our company is working on an edge of something that is, let's say, borderline legal. Borderline meaning that we're actually, for example, a law enforcement agency preventing certain crimes.
Yep.
But the LLM is built with guardrails, not ever to touch upon those crimes. So you either have to jailbreak it or do adversarial prompting.
Yep.
That fine-tunes the model. But without that awareness of such guardrails, you're already introducing a lot of error into your output.
I think this is a really fascinating case because what it highlights is that for all that a lot of people are engaging with these tools and being led to the belief or the illusion that they're chatting with a very intelligent entity, these are products, and there have been product choices made in the design and implementation of these products. And those product choices are oriented around the risk profile and risk appetite of the company that's selling the product. And they're not always transparent around either the data sets that are incorporated into it or the fine-tuning and the other kind of guardrails and other sort of supporting systems that they've built in around it. And so to sort of like tie your business to this thing, which is so opaque, I think presents a lot of risk. But it doesn't mean there's not opportunity there as well. I understand why people are doing this. It's just, like I said, I have a pretty cynical view about the whole sector. So that's a thing. But this is, this is interesting because it does lead to, like, on the flip side. So we talked about large language models for the creation of glossaries and terminology and definitions. On the other side, though, I think if you are using large language models, if you have created your own glossaries, I have heard some reports from people that providing those glossaries as part of the context to your large language model can actually be very helpful because it can help focus on the definitions and the specific meanings that are relevant to you, which means that it's more likely to find within its training set relevant outputs and stuff that's actually useful to you. So a guy was using it to create code, and he said it kept going off the rails and doing the wrong stuff. And he wrote some glossary definitions in my contextive file format, added that to the context for his tool, and it improved the quality of the code it was creating because it actually knew now what he meant by some of the terms he was using it gave more context to what he was talking about. Now, again, I think there's risks and problems with that, but I'm saying if you're doing it, it could be something that's helpful to you.
It always depends on the use case and how correct the output is and how much effort you put in to actually validate the output.
Absolutely.
Because if it's a completely automated process and you don't have any validation guardrails on the output, then of course you'll even if you provide proper training material and you fine-tune the model with that context that you give, it still is at risk without
absolutely
oversight.
Yeah.
And that will create new language, but it's completely irrelevant to the problem domain that you're in and to the company that you're in.
Yeah, I think the best way to sum it up actually was in the DORA report 2025 around like the impact of LLMs on coding, and what they basically, like, to summarize it, they said that it's a multiplier. So if you're already doing, like, following good practices, it can speed you up. So by good practices, I mean continuous delivery, having strong quality harnesses, working in small batches, breaking things down, all that kind of stuff. It can be really good. If you're not, it will actually slow you down. And this is part of, like, if you don't have processes in place to check that it's correct, functionally correct, you're not reviewing the code, you're not frequently refactoring, making more modular designs so that there's smaller amount of context required to work on the code. Exactly what we've been talking about for years with modular designs and breaking things down into smaller components so it can fit in our heads. Now we're talking about breaking it down into smaller components so it can fit in the LLM's context window. It's all the same kind of thinking, right? So if you're not doing that, it's going to slow you down. If you are doing it, it might speed you up. And this is sort of the evidence that we're seeing so far from organizations like DORA and MITRE. So yeah, it kind of reminds me of saying, like, you got to be checking it.
It just dawned on me that I don't know if you're familiar with a term called script kiddie.
Script kiddie, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very old school term.
Yeah.
I don't know if it comes from I do have this very old school dictionary by Eric Eric S. Raymond. I think that's a dictionary. Let me just quickly check the date on it.
Mm.
1993. That's a very old school one. I'm not sure if the term script kiddie is defined in this dictionary, but a script kiddie, no, it's not, unfortunately. The Eric Raymond has defined the word hacker, cracker, and script kiddie back in the day in his hackers manifestos, etc. Right? So I never considered myself neither a hacker or a cracker. I was always a script kiddie. So I basically took a bunch of code and repurposed it for whatever I use without proper understanding of the code.
Okay.
Now, vibe coding is basically script kiddies doing stuff, right? But what I find,
code they found without understanding how it works. Yeah.
But what I found from this experience back in the day when I was a teenager and I was that script kiddie doing this kind of stuff, that actually through doing that and trying to make it run in my code base, I started learning what it actually does. So looking into the small chunks of context and the small chunks of language that I'm using when I'm coding something, and I'm not coding that much as an architect nowadays, but I do still try to code every now and then just to not to be too rusty. So I'm basically coding Google script most of the time because I'm working on certain automations for myself. Okay, I don't have the time in the day to read the whole goddamn documentation of Google scripts and all the available libraries. So I'm just going to ask Gemini because it has a direct tie into all that documentation. Perfect. If I ask Gemini in a plain language to create me a specific functionality in, let's say, Google Sheets, whatever, it will start just sifting loads of code, which is completely not what I wanted in terms of functional requirements. So what I ended up doing, instead of just copy-pasting that big chunk of code into my IDE and running it in Google Script, I ended up just not asking for the functional aspect, but start coding myself and then asking for specific solutions over specific technical problems. So I'm in the control of the language. I'm in the control of the functional requirements. And the only thing that the LLM is doing for me is supporting me technically and giving me options how to resolve my technical issues and help me understand the errors way faster. That means that I can actually code those automations a lot quicker. And the only thing I'm left with is actually pondering on the problem domain, as in what problem I'm solving and how do I want it solved so that it facilitates what I need to do. So, for example, automate the creation of this live stream. Yeah. That's one of the things that I automated to about 90%. Graphics, materials, descriptions, generating JSON files for the web page, etc. All that is now automated, and I had to write it myself. But to write it, I didn't have time to figure it out myself, so I just LLM'd it, right? And it works, but I was in the control of the language all the time.
Yeah.
And it was my problem, right?
One thing, sometimes people have a very positive result from even your first attempt, like just give it a vague description and you get like a massive thing. I think that what we're seeing is that the cases where that's most useful is where what you're asking for is something that's well represented in the training data. So it's like a common problem or common solutions. And the more you vary from that, the more you get down to like what's unique in your context, the more likely you're going to have to provide that kind of more tight oversight, or as Lucian calls like spec-driven approach to LLM development.
Yeah.
I don't want to get too bogged down in that sort of things. I don't know, you're probably going to have other people who are more expert in it than I am to talk about it. But I think there's an interesting with language because it is all language. Right?
For all of you interested in spec-driven development and LLMs, we're actually talking about that next week. Exactly the topic next week. The topic is can we get rid of developers? I know, cringy, hooky, clickbaity title. Sorry, but it's actually exactly the topic of next week's stream, where we're going to be talking about the impact of AI, generative AI, LLMs on development, and can we finally get rid of those developers? Probably not.
Expensive developers.
No,
Interesting.
no, that's been iterated over the years, like introduction of object-oriented programming. Yes, finally we can get rid of those pesky
Generation
developers doing.
languages, no code platforms. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
I think
and
it reveals a real misunderstanding for me. Not to not to jump ahead what you're going to talk about next week, but thinking that you can get rid of developers, like, again, to everything we've been talking about, it suggests like a vast misunderstanding of what is the role of a developer. And as my belief is that, as you put it earlier, to solve problems, to solve problems for the business with technology. And as we've seen, like, LLMs can't do that on their own without guidance. And so it's just, we're sort of changing the nature of the role, but it's still a role to craft solutions, to understand problems, and to help build technology.
And they cannot
implement those solutions.
They cannot solve those problems because they're incapable of learning our jargon and context, because they have their own stemming from the training data that they received, right? So they have an approximation of certain jargons and certain languages, but that is limited only to their training data. And if we have different semantic understanding of words, which stems from exactly that ubiquitous language or company jargon or the living language, if we have that one built, then obviously they will have problems understanding it unless somebody is actually very vocal about that on the web and produces materials that are available to those LLMs to crawl through. And if they catch, oh, this is this context, oh, now we're going to switch to that particular language, and statistically makes it more feasible that the output will be better, right?
I think it's a really interesting framework that can help make sense of that to an extent, which is a thing called Wardley mapping. I don't know if you come across this, but
Simon heard too many times, still don't know what that is.
Okay, well, I'm not going to talk about the whole thing, but one key idea in it is that elements of your system or elements of your business can be mapped onto a stage of evolution. And the stage of evolution, it starts from like what they call genesis, which is like it's novel, it's brand new, it's sort of innovative, it's unknown, a lot of risk attached to it. Then it progresses into like a custom stage, which is where it's more well known, but it still requires custom work to make it happen. Then it evolves into a product stage where there's like standard products that you can buy off the shelf. And then it evolves into a commodity stage where you like rent it for cents on the dollar. You don't buy it anymore, you rent it. And when you look at almost any sort of technical development, it's sort of progressed in different speeds through these stages. It's a model, it's a way of understanding things. Nothing's like there's not strict boundaries, but it's kind of, I find it quite intuitive and it makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, you can look at it, electricity. In the very early days, it was Genesis. You needed to like build your own generator. Then you could order a custom generator from a supplier. Then you could buy a generator off the shelf, and then you could get electricity out of the wall and pay cents on the kilowatts, right? And then with compute, we had the same thing. You had to build your own computer. Then you could buy a custom computer from IBM. Then you could buy computers off the shelf, and now we rent them. We're at compute capacity for cents from Amazon and Azure. So this structure, like might be years, might be decades. It's very similar. But it's not just for products. You know, you can apply this 4 phases to practices, to data, to knowledge. And when you do apply it to the concept of domains, you see that there are domains that are in that 4th stage, this commodity domains. What do I mean by that? Accounting is a commodity domain. You've got accounts, you've got journals, journal entries, debit, credit, assets, liabilities. That domain has been modeled to death for like decades, for centuries. It's very well defined. It's very clearly understood. People are trained in it. There's a lot of documentation on it. It's a ubiquitous, it's a commodity domain. CRMs have been progressing down this path to the point where we now, I think, maybe 20 years ago, every CRM had a different terminology, but now it's kind of industry standard around things like leads and opportunities and contacts and things. Most people that are in businesses building new and innovative products, they need to be operating in the sort of Genesis custom phase, because otherwise you're just doing the same thing everyone else is doing. You might have it as a core or some key part of it, something that's a utility that other people are doing, but you need to be doing something new and innovative that's value add. So one of the nice things about Wardley mapping is it helps you map out your landscape. What are we doing that's the same as everyone else, or that other people are selling or renting out as a utility? What are we doing that's genuinely unique and novel and is in this genesis phase? And what are we going to do when the industry evolves? We're going to be left behind treating it like it's genesis when everyone else is treating it like a product or a utility. Where I'm going to is with domains and with language in particular is that you can see this thing happening. So even just last week, Google released like a commerce protocol, which is being designed for agentic e-commerce. Like that's been the trigger for it is so that you can buy stuff through your agent, through your LLM. But the truth is, when you look at it, it's just a standard protocol. But what I think about it in terms of looking at it through this lens is that they've pushed e-commerce from a product into a commodity. The modeling now and the language is going to become a utility standard in the e-commerce domain. So if you are writing code that is dealing with a domain that is a commodity, you can find a lot of information in the public data set that these models were trained on. It will probably be more effective because that is well defined, it's standard, it's in the public data set. If you're writing code that's dealing with something novel and innovative that's in the genesis or custom phases of the Wardley cycle, you're going to need to provide more of your own context, as you put it. So I don't want to say like you have to always provide context, because you might be working in a domain that's actually a ubiquitous commodity accepted utility domain. But this is what I like about Wardley mapping, is it helps you make a bit more sense. Like where actually are we in this? How much should we be thinking about this as like something that's completely new? How much should we be drawing on standards and standard practices? And I think it's really interesting when you see things fail, it's often because people are either trying to do something as genesis that is actually a utility, or they're trying to treat it as a utility when it's actually genesis. So premature standardization suffers from this, because you see people push out a public standard and try to treat it like a utility, when actually the industry as a whole hasn't modeled that domain well enough yet, and it ends up being unsatisfactory and needs to iterate more rapidly, and get people like suffering because they've tied themselves tightly to something that actually was presented as a utility when it wasn't mature enough yet to be a utility. And you talked about like SAP's German acronyms before. I think that's an example of that. SAP tried to say, oh, this is the utility standard, before the domain had actually been modeled well enough by the industry to arrive at a broad consensus about what it actually should be. So if you can do the analysis and come up with your own judgment about where these things live on the landscape, you can probably apply a little bit more judgment around like how to actually, how to focus your efforts on, can you trust what the LLMs are putting out? Do you need to put more of your own context and thinking into it? Where are you in the cycle?
And if I'm like thinking about examples, and I tried some time ago, and I'm never going back to that for the LLM, to prompt about integration architecture. And LLMs know nothing about integration architecture. What they know about is APIs. They know how to compose a REST service, a SOAP service, etc. But that's like the bare minimum. That's the peak of the iceberg of integration architecture, is exactly that part. And if I try to talk about integration platforms, they have no idea what that is and what is the architecture related to that in terms of these kind of things. So basically, the knowledge I have in my head, and that I describe also what bridging the gap, is somewhere around that custom area of the Wardley maps, right? Yep. But in my head also popped up a thought: how do Wardley maps translate to different types of domains in DDD? Because in DDD we have core domain, supporting domain, and a generic domain, right? So I'm guessing that the utility, the last stage, would be the generic, right? And then the Genesis custom probably would be the core domain, and the third one is the supporting domain, something like that. Probably a little bit more fluid than that, but that would be the rough.
Yeah, there's definitely some alignment there. So Susan Kaiser has just recently published a book which is all about DDD, team topologies, and Wardley mapping, and it speaks specifically to that alignment. And it definitely, I think, draws attention to it's a loose relationship. Like it's more of a convergent evolution, I'd say, rather than something that was set out to be explicitly aligned. But there's definitely like similarities in the way that people think about commodity Wardley mapping components and supporting generic subdomains. Absolutely. and similarly with core domains. So yeah, you might be interested in that book.
Is that by chance the book called Architecture for Flow?
Yeah, that's the one. Yep.
All right. I actually have it on my list, and I have a digital copy of it. I just need to read it. It's still pending. But yes, it's there already on the list, waiting for a good read. But reading takes a lot of time that I don't really have, unfortunately. But all right, for those interested, I'll pop a link in the QR in a moment. Yeah, so yeah, that's. Oh, we drifted quite far from just the ubiquitous language. Went into the ubiquitous language and LLMs. But then
it's all related. It's all
related, yes. But going back to more less Gen AI related topics, we already touched upon a little bit how the language evolves. But in that evolution, perhaps we should go into more of examples of what do teams struggle with, and what are the common problems with the evolving language, and what companies struggle with. Because you, as a coach, you do help teams and CTOs, etc., with that as well, I assume, right? So you probably have a broad plethora of examples of what went wrong.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So Lucian's question from before about reconciling the ubiquitous language with technical constraints in legacy systems, it's definitely a common challenge people have. It's because they haven't been treating it as a living language. They haven't been embodying those changes into the code base. So I think that, like, a big challenge that teams have is that they've let the language has evolved, but the code hasn't followed. So I'm a big believer in trying to evolve the code. As soon as you hear that change in the language, evolve the code as quickly as you can. And that gets back to the comments I made earlier about what supports you in doing that, having a great test harness around your system so you can make those changes quickly and sort of get on with it. But to make that happen, another challenge people have is actually even detecting that the language has changed. And then another challenge related to that is, okay, say you've detected that the language has changed and you've absorbed it into your code or into your glossaries or documentation. How do you communicate that change out to, like, all the people that need to know about it? So these are some, common patterns that I see teams struggling with, and it's often why, that they end up in these problems, because they're struggling with these challenges. So, some common things that I've seen people try to do to resolve it are either like documentation in a wiki, for example, which has some benefits, but also some drawbacks. Main drawback being that it's like, I don't want to say it's a long way away from where you're working, because ultimately everything's just a click away, but it feels a long way away. There's this sort of sense of distance between your code and your company Confluence, right? So people are not regularly going and searching in Confluence to check what a word means when they're having a conversation on Slack or in person. What they're doing is they're having the conversation, they're making an assumption, and then they're moving on with that assumption. They're not checking, whether they understood it correctly. I see other teams trying to put this sort of documentation beside the code, sort of like a kind of a living documentation in Markdown files. And I think that's for some of this kind of documentation, it's better. At least it's closer to the code. You're more likely to find it if you're searching across your repository. If you're making changes to it, hopefully people are going to see it in PRs and other kind of code change things. But that has some other challenges, which is that it sort of then constrains it to just the developers, and other people outside the dev team are not necessarily going to see or get the benefits of that, particularly if it's the kind of documentation and knowledge that is not just about how is the thing implemented. Architecture decision records, absolutely keep them in Markdown files in your code base, because that's where people need to be looking at it. But things that capture domain knowledge should be more broadly accessible, so that people outside the dev team, product owners, BAs, customer service people, salespeople should be able to access that as well. So all of these problems, whether it's like detecting that the language has drifted, tracking the changes to it, communicating to people that the change has happened, these are all actually what led me to develop this Contextive tool, because I was sort of realizing that there must be a way to do this more effectively. I tried the glossary in a Confluence page. Inevitably, 12 months later, it was out of date. and someone would join the company and say, what do these words mean? And someone would say, I'll go check the glossary. They would go look at the glossary and say, this doesn't seem right. It says here it means this, but you guys were talking about it this other way the other day. Oh yeah, that changed 6 months ago and we never updated it. And then it becomes the new starter's job to go and update the glossary in the wiki, and and the cycle repeats itself. And I've spoken to teams that have tried to do it in markdown files and repositories, and they had some of those same problems, which is that people outside the dev team couldn't see it, and similarly, I mean, even though it was closer, it wasn't right there, and a lot of teams or people in the team didn't know it was there, and never found that information. So what I found myself thinking about is, like, is there a way to embed this information into the places people are working in a way that is like unobtrusive but helpful? And I realized that we've got like a great model for how this could be done with the way that we handle like inline documentation in our code, XML docs and Java docs and so on, Python, PyDocs. They're embedded in the code in comments, and they are like surfaced while we're working on the code, like tooltips and things. So you can hover over a language element and it'll tell you some documentation around it. We're kind of used to that, but we don't, up until now, we didn't have anything like that for domain knowledge. We only had it for the technical implementation. And this is where contextive came from. So actually, it feels like it's a good time to maybe do a screen share and show a quick demo of like how this thing works. So I'm actually going to, I know I set up a screen share before, but I'm going to change it if that's all right, because
yeah, go ahead, prep it.
So I'm briefly going to look at where is it? There we go. So say in VS Code, we're talking to developers, right? So the way this tool works is, let's say I'm going to set up like a loosely coupled glossary.
Sure.
And what we do is we're going to have a set of contexts.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say the first context, I don't know, what's the domain you're working in at the moment? Well, let's make this sort of something more realistic.
Sorry, once again?
What's a domain that you're working in at the moment?
That's a good question. How to define that then?
Or maybe just a domain you're familiar with. We can.
Domain I'm familiar with is always integration architecture.
Okay, less technical. I don't know.
Less technical, but so let's in that sense, let's dismantle bridging the gap. So one of the domains would be loosely coupled, right? That's one of the domains. Okay. The other domain is.
Oh, sorry, I don't mean like DNS domains. I mean, or are you not talking about? Sorry.
No. I'm talking about problem domains.
Okay, so the problem is
if I take bridging the gap as a open source. Oh, you wrote coupling. If I'm talking about bridging the gap as a open source project, which it is, and within that project, what we do, one of the domains is loosely coupled the live stream, right? So this is one of the domains.
Oh, okay. So live streaming is more the generic domain.
Yeah, we can name it live streaming. Yes.
Gotcha. Sure. So what's
terms?
Yeah.
Okay. One of the terms is a speaker. Studio, I suppose. Oh, the definition of a speaker. That's an invited guest to the live stream with a specific topic to talk about.
Yeah, and then studio?
Studio is where the conversation happens, which is an isolated environment.
Okay, cool. This is probably enough for now. So one of the things that's cool now is, so now because I've got contextive installed, I can get this definition, pops up in the tooltip, of when I hover over the word speaker. And the way that it works is specifically not tied to any particular language. So it works in the YAML. It could work in like a
MD file.
MD file, and it's in the autocomplete as well. So
oh wow, brilliant!
Get it right there, and then so speaker, and I can get the hover tooltip there as well. Invite guests to be in the live stream.
Right.
Is invited to the studio. And
okay,
so we get that.
I'm gonna throw in the curveball. Another domain in loosely coupled, in bridging the gap would be then public speaking conferences, right?
Yeah.
And that's a completely different context where the word speaker does not refer to a guest, but refers mostly to me or Philip.
Yep.
Right.
Gotcha.
So that's that's then a different domain, but the same term. And now, how does that work if I define that in contextive?
So you can create multiple glossaries, and so if you're putting those glossary files in YAML files in your source code, which is something that you can do in the open source version. So there's a whole open source tool set that is completely free, and you can do you can get all of the stuff we're demoing now with that open source tool. What you do is it's either separate repositories or separate folders. So let's do these ones, and I'll do a new file, public speaking. Oh, I've lost the screen share. Is that mine?
Yeah, it just dropped out. So yeah, you disconnected, unfortunately.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. Going back on. There we go.
There we go. Public speaking. To manage, what we say, the speaking engagements for the loosely coupled live stream hosts, something like that, or is it
bridging the gap members? Yeah.
And then the speaker is one of the bridging the gap members. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is a great example. So you've got the word speaker could have multiple definitions. So you've got the public speaking context, live streaming context. And actually, I'm just going to usually, sort of moving these things around. It should only show you one of those definitions, because we're in the public speaking folder. If you go in the live stream folder, we just get the live streaming context. So if we've got some code in the live stream domain, we'll see the live streaming context.
Right.
And if we put it in the public speaking domain, so this could be a, React, then you'll get the public speaking context.
Right. And then what happens if I go outside of these folders and create a completely new file somewhere and start?
You get nothing. Yeah, because you're not in those domains. So there's multiple ways that you can handle it. If you do want to see all of the definitions, you can put those glossary files in the root. Basically, the definitions apply to the current folder and any subfolder. So if you want to put them in the root, you can get those definitions in every file. But usually, it's more useful to have them closer to the code that is relevant to that definition.
True.
So definition is useful in that location. So this is really good, and we've got a lot of things we can do this. We can have definitions. We can have example sentences. So we could say, has the speaker accepted the invite? So we get an example of how that phrase would actually be used in a sentence. And you can do aliases. So the speaker might be the guest.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, when you hover over guest, you get the definition for speaker, and it notes that it's an alias of the word guest. So this is a great way to do acronyms as well. So I saw there's a comment from Lucy on frustration with abbreviations and acronyms. You can set up a definition, but then you can put all of the acronyms if they have the same meaning in the aliases list, and then you get the same sort of support with seeing that definition wherever that acronym is used as well. which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's good, because then you actually manage the acronyms. So if you have, like, let's say, domain-driven design that resolves to DDD, well,
Yeah.
not a lot of acronyms that are DDD, but then AI, already a few, right? Or
Yeah.
some other terms that have multiple different resolutions of an abbreviation, and then this actually keeps the sanity, because it can tie it down to a specific phrase or word, and then have those as aliases. That's actually brilliant.
Yeah, so
That,
it works quite well. So this is all publicly available. It's open source. You can install it in your IDE extension and start adding these YAML files to your repositories, and off you go. But as I mentioned before, one of the challenges with this is that it's kind of too tightly scoped to the dev team. You know, people outside the dev team don't necessarily get the benefit of this. So this is something we've been working on for a little while, which is to actually allow people to manage, and I'll move this over here, hopefully you can see it, their glossaries in a place that everyone in the business has access to. For example, Notion. So if you sign up for a Contextive cloud account, which is in private beta at the moment. So this, if people did that QR code that you put up at the start, they'll go on a wait list and gradually get access to this. It's going live gradually this year. You can link to your Notion account. It'll set up this database structure in Notion, and you can define your terms. So, you know, we can put another term, you know, in here. We've currently got this context. This is a set of terms related to the context of glossaries themselves. So actually I haven't defined the word alias here, but let's just define that. So like an alias is like an alternative term that has the same meaning as a primary term, and it's in the context of managing glossaries, but you can set up multiple contexts as well. You can also set up like metadata by adding custom fields, and they get attached to that terminology. Oh, I've lost the screen share again. So,
oh my.
Probably something to do with my Mac. And then what's happening in the background here is that Notion does like a webhook once a minute with any changes. And so we're going to see, I'll move this over here. It's not there yet, but hopefully in a second, that new term that is in the glossaries, the alias term, will appear here.
There you go.
There it is. So that's synced across to the Contextive app. And you can see some of these words are highlighted. So there's a Contextive browser plugin. And if I refresh the glossary now, so it picks up that new one, all these terms have got this little underline, which says that they're known terminology in the glossary. And so if we hover it, we get that new definition, an alternative term that has the same meaning as a primary term. We can view it in the glossary, which opens it up over here. So you can see all of these things over here. And so, you know, the word context might have an alias of a domain or a bounded context, which is not strictly true in the DDD sense, but it's frequently true in businesses that I engage with. So this is the point of trying to say, hey, we don't want this terminology just to be available to the dev team. We want it to be something that the broader business can engage with. We want it in the wiki because that's an easy place for maintaining it, but it can't just live there because then nobody is ever going to see it. So by putting it in the browser extension, we can actually see this popping up, you know, on any web page, any page that you add to. So if we say, what pages do we want this to be in? We can like add sites. So I could add it. That's already on the Contextive site. You could add GitHub here, for example, and you could get these things highlighted even when you're browsing the source code on GitHub. But the other thing that is kind of cool here is all of this terminology is also exposed via API to the browser, sorry, to the source code as well. So I've got like if you set up a glossary file like this that imports from the URL of that extension, we can actually see like alias, an alternative term that has the same meaning as the primary term, is now available in the source code too. And that's exactly the definition that was entered into Notion. So it's all integrated in the sense that you manage the glossary in in a public space that people can review, and you can add comments and discussion around it, but it gets broadcast, well, it synchronizes over into the contextive service, and then that publishes it out to all the places where people are working. So you've got IDE extensions to pull it into the source code. You've got browser extensions to make it available on like arbitrary web pages. And coming soon is going to be a Slackbot integration, so you can access it in your Slack conversations, and also some dedicated integrations for things like Figma and Miro and Google Docs and stuff like that. So it's really kind of, the vision here is to make this concept of the ubiquitous language actually ubiquitous, and make it easier for people to understand the terminology, to use the correct terminology, and to detect when it's evolving. Because if you see a conversation in Slack and then you see this definition like appear right next to it, you'll be able to more easily tell, oh, hang on, this definition isn't right, but this is the definition that developers are looking at when they're writing the code. There's a problem here. We need to get this sorted out.
Yeah,
that's kind of the.
But then if you have this defined properly from the perspective, from the bottoms up, and developers are defining the glossaries for themselves, and then they, through that plugin, you, for example, go into Jira and have this available in Jira or Confluence, then basically you can write all sorts of lovely documentation without actually creating those glossaries in Confluence that you have to go ping back and forth between documents. You have them running
what
live.
I'm seeing happening is that in businesses, like a realistic pattern is that some terminology is going to be maintained by the developers in YAML files in the repositories, and some terminology is going to be maintained by business stakeholders in Notion. And this is actually the purpose of building Contextive in this way. I've actually got a nice, let me see if I can find the diagram. Oh, here it is. Let me bring this over. So the idea, if we've got these terminology sources, so whether it's Notion or like YAML files are being pushed into the API, or you can even manage the glossary in Contextive itself, it all gets merged into your like organizational wide glossary and then published out to the various places where people are working. So you can have the developers maintain some glossary definitions that are more relevant to like the private, to the code, and business stakeholders can maintain some definitions in Notion, but all of it's visible to everybody through the various publishing mechanisms. So trying to make it flexible and fluid, but the key thing is like transparency and visibility of what different people are using across different contexts within the business.
Yeah, and then if you're in a business that actually has some sort of a managed hardware like laptops, and you enforce a specific browser like Google Chrome, and they have Google Workspace accounts where you can actually manage the extensions of Google Chrome. You enforce installation of the extension, and by that, people already have access to that without even knowing that this extension exists. So they don't have to set up anything, which makes life a lot easier for anybody managing that in that sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, but I mean, that's one option. I'm working with a company right now that doesn't have that, but they're just getting the team members to install the extension. And
that works as well, of course.
There's a lot of different ways to do it, but this is kind of like, I guess, the culmination of the whole last 2 hours of conversation, which is, language is important. You need to put some effort into thinking about it, but don't just let it be something that kind of is a one and done when you do your design phase. Embed it into your working practices. Make it part of make it a genuine living language by, capturing it in places that are easy to maintain and surfacing it in the places people are working, so it's easy to find, to detect the ambient changes that make it like stale, and then to get it updated. So it's got to be something that is like genuinely a living ubiquitous language.
I mean, from my perspective as a content creator and somebody who writes a lot of articles, I would just really use it on Google Docs, like all the time, just to remind myself how I define specific terms. Am I using them still correctly in the context that I'm writing the article in, so that I don't go crazy with that. And then, for example, if I would combine that with tools like Obsidian and make a graph dependency map of certain terms and topics between, that would then build even more cohesion over the content.
Yeah.
Just a different example of use where that language build is really important. And given that, for example, Bridging the Gap and the article writing for Bridging the Gap spans over the last 2.5 years, with research done in between writing articles. So my domain knowledge actually grew over the last 2.5 years, where it's been also changing the language I use. Because now I'm weaponized with all sorts of different terms and better understanding of and a deeper understanding of different aspects of what I do as an architect. So that means that my language 2.5 years ago, where I started with the first article, and my language now is already different, which means that probably the first 2 or 3 articles are completely out of whack in terms of the meaning of terms that I use there, whereas the terms I'm using right now are more precise and more deliberate. But still, the lack of cohesion, and to capture that cohesion,
could be quite helpful. I mean, it's fascinating to hear that story from you, because I think that's like a microcosm of what every organization goes through. Like everything evolves over time, and things that were created a long time ago feel stale and obsolete. And anything we can do to help people maintain it and keep it up to date, I think is going to be helpful. So what I'm trying to focus on here is particularly like terminology and glossaries. I'd love to see other people sort of working on tools in and around other things. I know there are tools like Event Catalog from David Boyne, and Simon Brown's C4 and Structurizer for architecture diagrams and event-driven architecture tooling, and there's various other things popping up in other spaces. But I'm hopeful that over time we'll get some nice tooling to really help people with this, because it's a constant common problem keeping this stuff up to date, and anything that can make it easier is welcome.
True. And cohesive, because it's not only about making it easier, it's also about that cohesion of understanding. Because the drift is real, the drift just happens, right? And it just, you need to be reminded either that you had defined that already, and now you're writing a new article, is this still the right definition, or should you go back, for example, and fix the definition? Which means that this impacts the model of whatever you were doing, and it doesn't have to be a model that is a data model or a piece of code. It's actually part of the model of your business. But that 100%. Means that a part of your business, a part of your knowledge base, a part of something is out of sync. If you start writing, you have a different understanding of the term, and now you see it pops up in your Google Docs, and it's like, oh, this is defined differently. Oh, we have a problem. This is exactly the living language, because then you see that there is a discrepancy.
Exactly right. That's the vision. That's the dream. And this idea of capturing like usage examples as well, I think could be really powerful from that sense. So one of my hopes is that, like, when you have, say, a customer service team who's using that browser extension, and they will see like a message come in from a customer, and a word in that message will be highlighted, and if they hover over it, it'll give them the definition in the domain, and they might go, oh, actually, this is a great example of a customer using this sentence. They highlight it, add to usage examples, and then that exact sentence that illustrates the usage of that term, as said by a customer or a domain expert, will then appear in the tooltips in the VS Code IDE for the developer. I love this idea of like connecting these different parts of the business and helping drive more shared understanding of how to communicate.
Yeah, that's a very interesting concept of how to make that language actually live and evolve in a more governed way, because it will evolve either way, but it's a matter of how much of a grasp we have on it, that and awareness of that evolution.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you use the word govern there, and I think some people sometimes they associate the word governed with like constraints. It needs to be managed, it needs to be slowed down, there needs to be an approval process or a check or something.
It can be that, yeah.
It can be that, but I'm a big fan of not trying to not attempting to like tie it down, because you can't stop it. Like, people are going to change the way they talk, but more just like observe it and react to it rapidly. Yeah. And this kind of and that kind of governance of supporting rapid change is what I think is very helpful, rather than like a lot of people's misconception of governance that it has to be about like blocking change. It's more about like managing change successfully and reducing risk is the key.
I mean, if I'm looking at it from even the user's perspective, if I could, for example, every time we're writing an article and the article goes through a review cycle within Bridging the Gap, it's always comments like, "Oh, you used an abbreviation. You never in this particular app's article, you never outrolled it to a full term." So there's a the way we do it with every time we use a term that we want to abbreviate later, and or use an abbreviation. The first the abbreviation is used, you have to use the full term, and then in brackets use the abbreviation. Then you can use the abbreviation later, right? But if I would embed Contextive into the website, not as a plugin, but as part of the website, then basically it becomes the glossary. So everybody reading an article would have highlights of the words, the terms that are defined in the glossary, and they instantly can gain the context of what they're reading, because they, instead of looking up a previous article on the subject matter, they can just look up the small glossary definition of that term, and then, for example, in the glossary have additional links pointing to the right articles that define define or talk about that topic.
Yeah, this idea has come up a bit. I've had someone request like a Docusaurus plugin to be able to pull these kind of glossaries in and publish them, as part of that. And it's definitely on my roadmap. It's if anyone would like to contribute that to the open source project, they're very welcome. I'll probably start looking at that in the second half of this year, but it's definitely on something I'd love to do.
We can definitely help you test it.
Good stuff.
That would be cool, because this is an actual use case we can, in Bridging the Gap at least, we can use. I see the other use cases in regular consulting work that I have, that I would absolutely use that in the code base, and use that in a Jira to align tickets with meaning and semantic understanding, and also in Confluence, just to shorten the amount of things I have to do between documentation. This kind of glossary would be amazing to have with a lot of clients, especially if the clients are using, for example, a different language. And here meaning an actual like discrepancy. I'm using English at work, but my client is using Dutch, and all the terms and the business terms are actually defined in Dutch. So having that kind of glossary of what those Dutch words mean, especially in the context of their business, that would be brilliant. That would be a brilliant time saver, because then I have a specific term in code or in Confluence that I don't understand, and it's used as a Dutch word in an English document, and I need to grasp it. And having that kind of help, that kind of plugin to just dive into those glossaries easily, time saver.
No, I think especially for people like consultants that have to come in and engage with the language very quickly, I can see being super helpful for them as well. So I'm really keen actually to talk to consulting firms that would like to help set their clients up with this to make their own lives easier as they jump between clients, So
I mean, the cognitive load needed to onboard a new consultant on the project or replace a consultant, with knowledge transfers, with getting the onboarding done, the relevant trainings done, the setting up an environment for a developer. And don't get me started on how setting up an environment works at some companies. I have war stories, but this all of this already is a humongous strain. And when you add on top of that you need to learn the context of the client, especially if you're a consultant like me, where I'm not a specific industry focused, because I work cross industry. That takes months at times to actually learn and understand what the hell they're talking about. And even with diving into the code, you're like, what is this? And then you have code written half in English and half in Dutch, and you're like, what? No, I don't get it.
Before the current incarnation of the terminology was agreed on. So all these challenges, definitely. I mean, you're living the problems that I'm trying to help solve here. So
precisely. So this would be, of course, this would be an effort to establish that glossary, but an effort that would definitely repay very quickly if you have a specific tool to help you build that glossary and maintain it and use it daily.
And I think this is the thing, by trying to make it easy to maintain, I also want to reduce the the overhead of getting started. I don't encourage people to say, go and create your whole glossary before you even push this thing out there. I'm like, even one term in a glossary is going to be better than no terms. And then
True.
because it's easy to add terms, you can just add them as you go. Because you want to, like, why not get the benefit of whatever you've done? So I'm a big fan of, like, push it out, start adding something, start small, and then build up the base of terminology as you go.
Yeah, basically, as you read something, oh, this is a very common term. Let's add it to the glossary.
Yeah, let's add it in. Yep.
Pretty much. And I would
Mhm.
already see that in all the articles I've written over the last few years, that there are certain terms that I just use constantly, and they just ask
Mm.
for a glossary definition to be just viewed on the page as a pop-up when you hover over it. It's just it would be just so much easier, because the topic I'm talking about will have, let's say, related articles, which are usually on our page at the end of the page. But if I'm talking about, let's say, event-driven architecture and event-driven patterns for interoperability across systems, fantastic. Then I link other patterns and the definition of event-driven architecture. But then in the article itself, we have the terms like performance, responsiveness, observability, auditability. We have types of coupling defined and described in context of that pattern, but not as a generic definition. And having that glossary to have that generic definition of a specific type of coupling that is a specific type on a system level interoperability, that would help, because then that would just, that's easier. And then you have a contextual definition of that pattern. Plenty various use cases that I have in mind right now that would actually be really good. And this is, again, living language. We have our domain of work, which is knowledge-based domain, then the live stream domain, then the public speaking domain, and these will have different terms in them, and they already have different terms in them. Some of my colleagues in Bridging the Gap, they have none of the terminology I use in live streams because they're completely not involved in the process. There's 5 of us. Everybody's doing something different.
Yep.
It's interesting. It's interesting. You're right. This is a macro scale of what your clients are going through and what I experience as a consultant and my clients are going through in terms of the evolution of language. Interesting. Very, very much so. All right. I think for the moment, given that it's 18 past 9, we've been at it for 2 hours, a little bit longer given that we were sitting in the studio before the stream. I think we reached the end of the stream for today. But I think, Chris, will be seeing you on the stream a few more times about specific different topics. That would be awesome. Before we jump off, as I said earlier in the stream, we have a next one next week. Well, 8 days. Had to move it to Thursday because of other engagements. And yes, we have a very clickbaity title called "Can We Get Rid of Developers? Is Specification the New Super Skill?" So yeah, we'll be talking about AI, Gen AI, using Gen AI in development, and can those companies finally get rid of developers and just give their business users ability to create code? Well, maybe not. We'll see. We'll talk about it. There are different arguments. And I think it's going to be a very fun and interesting conversation to be had. And joining us on this stream is Sven Helge Huber, who's actually a fan of the show. He's always watching us while making dinner, so hopefully he was watching it today as well. And of course, if you're new with the stream, go visit Bridging the Gap, see what we do. We have a list of all the other streams in there on the page. We have articles about integration architecture. We have some trainings coming up and more events that are not loosely coupled events, but actual workshops that we're going to be running. And of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel to get notified about the future live streams and other video content that we'll be posting. And we're constantly working on materials, so hopefully soon enough we'll get more materials on the channel. That said, Chris, thank you so much for joining. It's been a pleasure. And for everybody still with us, have a lovely evening and night.